When you grow up in an abusive household, it can be hard to be sure if the things you remember are imagined or if they really happened. So much abuse is predicated on the idea that you keep your victim off kilter. Keep them guessing not only as to what comes next, but if what has already happened really did. When I look back on my childhood now, I feel that way about a great many things. It's hard to remember things objectively since so much of that time was spent in fear for myself, as well as my brother. First though, let me tell you who I am. My name is Nathan Taylor, and if you are from the same small northern Oregon town as me, you already know my story. My name, as well as my brother's name, are the stuff of legend there. But the name you're more likely to have heard would be Bill Taylor. That's my father, and his name made national headlines for a time because he murdered my brother and tried to kill me too. Jeremy was just about 7 years older than me. We were close in the way that only a pair of brothers who both hate their father can be. We endured the same drunken tirades, were whipped with the same belt, and spent the same long nights in the same room being as quiet as possible, since one noise could set the old man off. My father, for his part, isn't a particularly physically imposing man. He's about 5'9", and at the time of these incidents was about 190 lbs. He's put on some weight since then from what I've seen, but prison will do that to you. It wasn't his stature that made us terrified of him, but what he turned into when he was drunk. He became another person entirely when he was drinking. That small man would suddenly become an 8-foot-tall, 500 lb monster whose sole intention was to hurt us. At least that's how it always seemed the mind of a child. I don't have any memory of our mother, though Jeremy did tell me some stories. I just know that her name was Mary, and she killed herself just shortly after I was born. Beyond that, I've never been able to find any real information. I don't even know where her grave is supposed to be. That's all relatively unimportant though. So my dad raised us boys alone, and he was a strict disciplinarian. He believed that the way to make a boy into a man was to beat the harsh realities of life into him, and never let him slack off for a moment. My boyhood was mostly spent pulling weeds out in the sun, cleaning up around the house, and attending school. I can't complain too much though, because Jeremy had it infinitely worse. As the oldest, Dad saw Jeremy's responsibility to take on the position as patriarch to be a given. He was on Jeremy incessantly, hounding him about doing better in school, finding a job, and providing money for the household. When Jeremy wasn't bending over backwards to appease our dad, he was usually looking out for me in one way or another. I remember him scaring off a kid who tried to steal my backpack. He fixed my bike for me when it broke down. He took me on adventures where we'd walk down washes, out into the surrounding countryside, or even occasionally into an abandoned building. He was an awesome older brother, and I don't think I could have endured all that our father brought down on us if not for him being there. You might have guessed from the things I've told you so far, but my dad was fond of the drink. His go-to was whiskey, and he had a couple of drinks each and every night. Those couple of drinks weren't the problem. It was the nights when a couple just wouldn't do the trick that we had to worry about. One of the first of those nights, when things got really bad, came when I was 8 years old. Dad had hit us before, don't get me wrong. We were no strangers to corporal punishment. But this was something else entirely. Dad came home around 7 and immediately started in on Jeremy.
"Why isn't dinner made yet, boy?"
he said as he set his coat down on the dining room table. He wore a flannel overshirt, unbuttoned, beneath which he wore his button-down work shirt with the Body Shop logo emblazoned above the left breast. His jeans were stained with oil, grease, and God knew what else. I can see that image clearly from the vantage point I held on the other side of the table, where I was doing my homework.
"Sorry, Dad, I haven't gotten to it yet,"
was all Jeremy said as he came downstairs. The sound of the front door opening and closing had surely summoned him from his room, where he must have gotten distracted and lost track of the time.
"Haven't gotten around to it yet,"
Dad said, incredulity splitting his furrowed brow. I could see the muscles in his arms tense as he clenched his fists and stuffed them in his pockets.
"I haven't gotten around to whipping your ass tonight either, but I can do that if you'd like."
"No, sir, I'm on it now,"
Jeremy said, briskly walking into the kitchen. His quick passage by the table, and Dad, was followed by the clanging sound of pots and pans being hurried into position.
"Fucking unbelievable," I bust ass all day at that shop for you and you don't even have a meal waiting for me when I get home. Ungrateful is what it is.
Dad said, shaking his head from side to side. Jeremy was old enough and knew better than to respond, but I was young and hadn't yet learned when it's best to keep your mouth shut. Lay off him, Dad. He's doing it now. That was all I said. But it was enough. Dad was across that table and over to me faster than I'd ever seen him move, and before I could register what was happening, I was out of my chair and up against the wall.
What the fuck did you just say to me, boy?
He snarled. He was holding me up by my arms, pinning me against the wall. His face was just inches from mine, and I got a good whiff of the booze on his breath. He'd already started drinking. I'm sorry, I stammered, already feeling fear adrenaline dumping into my body.
Yeah, sorry is exactly what you're gonna be.
He roared, shaking my wiry body against the wall. Then he was off of me, and though I thought he'd just let me go, I quickly saw that Jeremy had pulled him back. That was a mistake. Dad wheeled around and without a second thought, cocked back and smashed a fist into the side of Jeremy's head. He went down pretty rough. He was just 15 or so at the time and had been in a couple of schoolyard fights, but nothing like this. He was on top of Jeremy then, sending slaps and the occasional punch raining down on Jeremy, who had curled into as tight a ball as he could manage and was covering his face. I started crying, begging my dad to get off of him, to let him up. He's had enough, I kept saying. I remember that clearly. Finally, after what was probably under a minute but seemed much longer, Dad stood up. He turned around and looked at me, and I could see the disgust in his face. I started to open my mouth to cry more, and the back of his right hand suddenly caught me across the cheek. I went down, more out of shock than anything else, but I knew better than to cry out.
You boys, you're a fucking disgrace. You're both just little demons, you know that?
He yelled, looking back and forth between us. Jeremy had regained some of his composure, but was staying where he was. I did the same.
You're fucking demons. I'm raising you, trying to do right by you, and this is what you give me. Why do I even bother?
As he stormed out of the dining area, he made sure to make a pit stop in the kitchen to grab his bottle of whiskey and a glass. He then barricaded himself in his room, and thankfully we didn't see him again that night. Hours later, as Jeremy and I laid down in our beds to get some much-needed sleep, I heard Jeremy whisper from his side of the room.
He's the fucking demon.
Was all he said. Things got worse from there. Dad's heavy drinking nights became more and more frequent, and the beatings became a regular thing. It had an impact on Jeremy more than me, and it was noticeable mostly in his behavior. He began to fail classes in school, as well as stay out later than he was supposed to. Chores slipped, and I even suspected he might be using drugs at one point. I never found out if that part was true, but honestly I wouldn't doubt it. Those years of his life were really rough. Of course, all of that behavior slippage just made Dad even more angry, which probably drove him to drink even more. Not that that's an excuse for how he behaved, but when you're an alcoholic, almost anything is a reason to drink. Besides just the beatings, Dad started sprinkling in some psychological abuse as well. He started telling us things that were obviously just designed to hurt us, but did the trick all the same. I remember one particular night, I think I was about 10 at the time, when Dad had a good drunk on, and Jeremy was nowhere to be found. We were sitting in the living room watching TV, and I remember starting to feel at ease because Dad seemed to be in an okay mood. He wasn't screaming, at least. Then, during a commercial break, he muted the TV and looked over at me. I didn't look back, not wanting to draw any kind of angry response out of him. Finally, after about 10 seconds of just staring at me, he took a sip from his whiskey glass and said,
You know I'm not joking when I tell you guys you're evil. You're a curse that has befallen me, and I can only assume it's for things I did a long time ago.
I didn't know what he was talking about, but I was afraid to question it. I just turned my head and looked at him, not sure if he was going to continue, or leave it at that. He went on.
I had to cut the fucking horns off your heads when you were born. With Jeremy, we just thought it was a weird medical condition, and it freaked us right on out, but we dealt with it. Then, when you came out the same way, well, your old mom couldn't take it, I guess. She killed herself just 2 months after you popped out.
He looked right into my eyes for the next part, as if to be sure I heard it.
She killed herself because of you, because you're fucking evil.
Then he turned back to the TV, set his drink down on the table, and unmuted it. I stayed down there for another 15 minutes, then made an excuse and went to bed. I cried myself to sleep that night and didn't even hear Jeremy come in. It was another 2 years before I started to notice that things weren't right with Jeremy. I already mentioned that he'd been staying out late, but around this time, when I was between 13 and 14, he just stopped coming home altogether some nights. It's really important that you know just how close my brother and I were. When Dad had his nights, Jeremy and I were all each other had. It became an issue of survival, and we banded together. We looked out for signs that Dad was on one. We covered for each other when he asked questions, and we comforted each other when he beat the shit out of us. Beyond that, we did just about everything else together. We walked to school together every morning, hung out together on the weekends, and even read the same books. I idolized Jeremy in a very real way, and when he started to take a turn for the worst, I was the first to notice. I confronted him about it one night when I'd stayed awake to see just how late he was really staying out. The door to our bedroom slowly opened, and I heard Jeremy enter, trying to be quiet. I checked the dim glow of my digital watch to confirm the time. 4:11 a.m. The sun would be out soon. "Where have you been?" I asked simply. I heard my brother tense up, clearly startled by my voice.
Oh shit. Nate, I didn't mean to wake you up. And anyway, I was just out. Go back to sleep.
"You didn't wake me up, Jeremy. I stayed up to see when you'd get home. You do this all the time, and I want to know why," I said, anger coming through more strongly in my voice than I'd intended.
Fuck, man.
Jeremy said, and I heard him plop down on his bed across the room from mine. He heaved a sigh before he continued.
I like being out there at night. With everything going on with Dad, it's nicer out there,
he said, and my eyes were adjusted enough to the night that I could see his head slump down toward his chest. He was being honest with me. "I can get that, I guess, but it just makes him angrier when you're not here," I said. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I'd always had a problem with that. Anytime a conversation between me and Jeremy turned serious, I'd cry. I hated it, even then in the dark when he couldn't see it.
I know. And I know I should be here to protect you, but I can't help it. Soon, though. Soon, Nate, I'm gonna get us the fuck out of here. I promise.
I hadn't said anything else, just rested my head on my pillow and cried. The night my brother died started out just like any of the others I've told you about. I got home before anyone else and started working on dinner. I was hoping to have the meatloaf out of the oven before Dad got home. That way I could finish the potatoes and vegetables while he was taking a shower. But more than an hour passed, and I'd already finished dinner without any sign of either of them. I figured Dad was working late and Jeremy was just out doing whatever Jeremy did. Knowing better than to eat before Dad got home, I went into the living room to do my homework while I watched TV. After another couple of hours, I started to get worried. It was already getting late into the evening, and Dad was never home this late. Something had happened. I just didn't know what. Got drunk at work again and crashed his truck into the highway guardrail, I thought to myself. And for a second, I actually enjoyed picturing that. Then the reality of the situation set in, and I realized that that very well could have happened. On the other hand, if I called the police and it turned out Dad was just out at the bar or something, he'd kill me. I decided to wait 30 more minutes, and then call if I hadn't heard from anyone. 10 minutes later, they both walked in the door together.
I don't fucking care, Jeremy. There's no excuse for this.
Dad was already yelling. I could tell from his voice, though, that he was stone sober.
I ought to have let them keep you, you fucking psychopath.
He shouted, storming from the front door to the staircase in a matter of seconds. Jeremy slinked in behind him, looking about a third his normal size. His head was firmly pointed down, and his shoulders were slumped in abject defeat. I stayed where I was on the couch, waiting to see how this would play out. Dad put his keys down on the table beside the staircase, then stripped his jacket off and dropped it on the floor. When he put his thumbs to his eyes, it took me a few seconds to realize what was happening. He was crying. I'd never seen that before.
I tried so fucking hard with you guys. I know I'm harsh on you, but Jesus fucking Christ, Jeremy, what is wrong with you?
He then marched up the stairs and slammed his bedroom door. I turned to Jeremy, who was standing just inside the doorway. I tried to ask him, but he cut me off immediately.
Not now, Nate. I don't want to talk about it.
With that, he'd headed off to our bedroom. When he closed the door, it was done as lightly as possible. I was so confused, and wanted to follow him into our room. But I'd seen that look in his eyes, and I knew that would be a bad idea. He really meant it. He didn't want to talk about it. I didn't have to wait too long, though. A little less than half an hour later, Dad came out of his room. He was just wearing his undershirt, pulled halfway out of his jeans. His belt was undone, and I could tell by his gait that he'd had a drink up there.
Come sit at the table, Nathan,
he said quietly, gesturing between myself and the table, where dinner was starting to get cold. I got up and took my normal place on his left side. He sat down in his spot at the head.
Serve us some food, please,
he said. I went through the motions of cutting slices off of the meatloaf and serving them onto our plates beside the potatoes and vegetables. I went through the motions and I kept it as tight as I could, because every hair on my body was on edge. I only ever saw Dad this calm before a storm. When the food was plated, Dad asked me to go pour him a drink. I did it without comment, getting a glass out of the freezer, where he kept them, wet so that they would get frosty, and pouring him a double on the rocks, like he liked it. I set it down in front of him and sat back down. He took a long drink, grimaced, set the glass back down, and began to talk.
Your brother. Jeremy did something horrible tonight, Nathan. Something really bad, and I think he's gonna have to leave us because of it.
I felt tears welling up already, and just asked, "What'd he do, Dad?"
I was asked out of work early by a pair of sheriffs today, Nate. They said they wanted me to come with them to their station, because they had some questions about my son.
He paused to take another drink. About half of the golden liquid was already gone. He continued.
I went, of course. They said it was about Jeremy, about a case they've been working for a while now, apparently. It started out with just some petty vandalism stuff. I guess he was breaking into some abandoned buildings. Anyway, they weren't really concerned with that. No, what they were worried about was...
He broke for another drink. No grimace this time, and I could see the warmth of the alcohol in his eyes. He clenched his fork hard enough to cause the tendons in his arm to stand out.
They showed me a video, Nate. A security video of your brother. Do you know what he was doing in that video, Nate? Can you take a guess?
I could see beads of sweat standing out on his brow. I didn't have a guess, but luckily the question was rhetorical.
That video showed your brother Jeremy beating a fucking dog to death with a shovel.
He roared, slamming his fist down on the table and causing the ice in his glass to jump about an inch. He opened his hands, letting his fork clang to the table, and ran them through his hair.
Your brother murdered a fucking dog, plain as day. They're gonna lock him up forever. The only reason I got to take him home tonight was because they're waiting on DNA and the arresting officer had his car worked on at my shop last month. He said I could take him home, but that he'd surely be coming back in.
Tears were running shallowly down Dad's face now, and his skin was turning beet red. He threw back the remaining whiskey in one gulp. I was stunned. I didn't want to believe it, especially coming from my dad. But he said there'd been a video. That meant it had to be real. Even though I knew it was likely going to get me a few slaps, I stood up from the table and ran to our bedroom. I heard Dad breathe harshly through his nose, then call out to me.
I don't think you'd be going in there if you'd seen the dog's body.
I entered the room and found Jeremy curled into a ball on his bed. I sat down next to him, not knowing what to say. Finally, after a long moment, I just said, "Is it true?" He sobbed, then looked up at me.
Yeah, it is, Nate. It's true.
What? Why? Why the fuck, Jeremy? I said loudly. I'd never used that word before, but I felt it come tumbling out in that moment. He didn't answer me, so I just got up and went to my bed. I was so many different things, scared, angry, dumbfounded, and more. I didn't know what to feel or do. We sat in silence for a long time. The only noises were Jeremy's sobs and rustling sounds coming from the kitchen, which I took to be Dad making himself another drink.
I think he's right,
Jeremy said meekly. I sat up straight and looked over at him. Right about what?
Right about us, Nate. Right about us being evil.
No, Jeremy. We're not evil. He is. He just says that stuff to mess with us. It's not true, and one day we're gonna get out of here, just like you.
It doesn't matter where we go, Nate. I don't feel anything on the inside. I'm dead, and all I want to do is make other things hurt the way I hurt.
Jeremy screamed this at me as loud as he could. I'd pressed myself up against the wall, never having heard Jeremy yell like this. Downstairs, I heard a glass shatter. Fuck, I thought to myself. No way he hadn't heard that. I figured he'd be in here any second to tear into Jeremy. I didn't know how right I was, but Jeremy wasn't done yet.
Nate, I killed that dog and guess what? I fucking liked it.
Jeremy was on his feet now, fists clenched at his sides. The tendons in his neck were straining as he screamed at me.
No, no.
I was screaming that over and over, and I put my hands to the side of my head so I could block him out. I closed my eyes. That last glimpse of Jeremy, him leaning forward slightly, face red, eyes streaked with tears, and mouth open in rage, was the last I got of him alive. As I screamed back at him and shook my head, eyes firmly shut and face covered in tears, a much louder noise overtook both of us. This was a noise so loud it can only be described as thunderous, and I felt it in my chest. My ears, despite being covered by my hands, began to ring almost immediately. My scream became even louder, shredding my vocal cords, but I couldn't hear it. I finally got my eyes open again after what seemed to be an eternity, and the sight before me didn't make any sense. Jeremy was careening forward, hands coming upwards toward his face, but his face was gone. There was nothing solid above his chin, just a red smear which was spreading infinitely slowly in my adrenaline-saturated system. The world became real again, and Jeremy's body hit the floor with a wet thud that I have never been able to forget. I was still screaming, but now I had no control over it. The room was filled with smoke and I could hear nothing. Beyond Jeremy, I saw my father. He stood in the doorway, a shotgun raised in his arms, now pointing at me. The gun was an old one he'd gotten from his own father, and it was the kind of double-barreled shotgun you see in old Western movies. He'd given Jeremy the first barrel, and was now standing there, stunned at what he'd done. I looked from him back to Jeremy's crumpled form, and I began to hyperventilate. The contents of my brother's skull were now splashed across every surface of the room in front of him, myself included. Reality snapped back into place for me a second time in as many seconds when I heard a loud metallic click, followed immediately by shit. I looked back up and realized that he'd just pulled the trigger again, at me this time. Something inside of me calculated the scenario faster than I ever could have done on my own, and I was on my feet. He threw the gun aside and charged at me, but tripped on Jeremy's feet and went down. I took the opportunity to jump onto him, causing him to gasp sharply when my foot came down in the middle of his back, and then I was leaping over him. I ran down the stairs and out of the house, and was able to get to a neighbor's house down the road before my dad caught me. It turned out that he hadn't even bothered to give chase, and in the distance as I got to my neighbor's front porch, I heard a second gunshot. Dad had tried to kill himself but failed. He blew the left side of his face off, but somehow only lost a small amount of brain matter and a good chunk of his skull. Chalk it up to fast response times and modern medicine, but they saved him. After his recovery, which took more than a year in total, he was tried and convicted. He only escaped the death penalty because he cooperated fully with the investigation and pleaded no contest to the charges he'd faced. He's currently riding out a life sentence in a supermax. As for me, I was bounced around foster homes a lot. As can be expected from something like what I went through, it didn't take long for me to start causing problems. I got in a ton of fights, shoplifted, and even started a couple of fires. Everyone in the system I dealt with was harsh, but they treated me lightly. I'm sure they'd seen my history and attributed that to my behavior. Something happened a few weeks ago, which I haven't been able to get off of my mind. I work at a drugstore, covering the night shift because it's guaranteed hours. I was walking back to my apartment one night at about 2 a.m. when I heard a whimpering sound coming from an alley. I stopped and waited a few seconds to make sure I'd heard it right. It came again, so I followed the sound down the alley. I could tell already that it was a dog. I found him before long, lying down behind a trash can. He was hurt bad, probably hit by a car, and had made it to this spot out of sheer panic before setting down to die. Blood caked the ground around him, and I could see a trail of bloody footprints leading down the other direction of the alley, where he must have come from. He was whimpering and breathing very shallowly. It was obvious that he was minutes from death. I knew what you're supposed to do in these situations. You have to be a man about it, and put the animal out of its misery. When a creature is suffering as badly as this dog obviously was, you did that because it was the right thing to do. But even as I pulled the pocket knife from its place clipped to my jeans, I remembered Jeremy. The video had turned out to be real. I'd been able to see it a few years later. I remembered seeing his black and white image, swinging the shovel down on the dog over and over until it stopped moving. I gripped the knife tighter in my hand. I trembled slightly, but I knew that this was the right thing to do. I resolved myself and quickly pushed the knife into the dog's throat. It whimpered again and then stopped moving. It had barely been hanging on by a thread anyway. That act, putting that dog out of its misery, was a bit of a watershed moment for me. It unlocked a part of my memories which were missing until now, and they've made me realize some things about myself. I'd forgotten about something that Jeremy and I had done when we were young, on a summer day when he was walking me home from school and we'd taken a detour to hang out in the woods for a bit. It had been around a year after our old man had started hitting the bottle, and us, much harder than before. We saw a rabbit. It was a young one, small enough to fit in the palms of my hands. It only took us a few moments to divide and conquer the pitiful little thing, and originally I think our intent was just to look at it, pet it, and let it go. But Jeremy said he wanted to tie its feet together, that it'd be funny. When he did, and the rabbit struggled to get free, I'd felt a sense of exhilaration that I'd never felt before. It didn't take long for things to get out of hand. Tying the rabbit up progressed to me swinging it around, which then turned into smacking it against the trees, and before I knew it, I was holding a bloody mess at the end of a rope. We both sort of realized what we'd done at the same time, and buried the broken little body. Though we'd agreed then and there to never speak of it again, I now have vague memories of experimenting on other animals for at least a year after that. I guess I can assume that Jeremy was doing the same, and for quite a bit longer. Sifting through these memories, I've thought heavily on that night when Jeremy killed the dog. He'd said that it felt good, and that Dad was right about us being evil. It occurs to me now that he was remembering the rabbit, though I'd already blocked it out of my mind by then. I shaved my head yesterday. Thinking about all of this, that night in front of the TV came back to me. That night when my dad had calmly told me that my mom killed herself because I'd been born with horns. I shaved my head, telling myself that when I saw that there were no scars, I would put this out of my mind and move on with my life. There are no scars on my head. There are, however, 2 quarter-sized birthmarks, one each on either side of my head, about 2 inches up from my ears. I think I'll be visiting my dad in jail soon.